Is everybody ready? We negate that on balance, a one-day national primary would be more beneficial for the United States than our current presidential primary process. In contention one is special interest. Chapman of US News and World Report writes in 2012 that a national primary would give a huge advantage to better funded candidates since you need expensive advertising and large campaign operations to run a national get-out-the-vote effort. Lesser-known candidates without extensive finances would not have an opportunity to reach out to all voters and build support. That's why former UN Ambassador Terry Schumacher argues in 2012 that a national primary would render voters less important than political consultants, calculated advertising, and super PACs. This is problematic because a surge in big money leads to a loss of trust in the political system. According to the Pew Research Center in 2016, a major factor in the public's negative attitudes about the federal government is its deep skepticism that money has a greater role in politics than in the past. 3/4 say elected officials put their own interests ahead of the country's, which manifests in the real world, as NYU's Brennan Center for Justice confirms in 2012 that 26% of Americans say they are considering not voting because big money has so much more influence than average Americans. By spiking reliance on big money, a shift to a national primary would likely push these uncertain voters past the tipping point. And this loss in political trust also has long-term consequences, as the OECD explains in 2013 that without trust in government, support for necessary reforms is difficult to mobilize, where short-term sacrifices are involved and long-term gains are less tangible. And because the perception of our government dictates its effectiveness, Blind of the UN concludes in 2006 that political trust is the motor of good governance. Contention 2 is building the president. The current system produces higher quality candidates in 3 ways, and the first is a feedback mechanism. The current system gives candidates a way of testing policy platforms over the course of a sequential primary, as Dartmouth in 2007 explains that under a national primary, no longer will candidates have a chance to experiment with themes that may resonate with the electorate. Pre-tested themes will supplant face-to-face contact with voters. The idea of a candidate using Iowa and New Hampshire to bring new life and new ideas to the party establishment will be a thing of the past. Second is fostering regional education. The sequential primary system forces candidates to learn about issues on a state-by-state basis rather than in broad strokes, as Schumacher continues that in the current process, presidential aspirants must interact with voters and elected officials from coast to coast. For example, Becker of Vice News writes in 2016 that with the New Hampshire primary, the state's drug crisis was thrust into the national spotlight. Candidates discussed finally recognizing addiction as a disease. Third is voter coordination. Caesarea of the Illinois News Bureau in 2015 reports that different groups of voters have several candidates to choose from that are ideologically aligned with them, and they will be more successful if they manage to coordinate on one candidate rather than splitting votes amongst them. In a one-day election with a large set of candidates, the candidate who would come out on top is often not the best one. By contrast, sequential elections allow voters to narrow down the field of contenders as a way of avoiding vote splitting among several similar candidates. And for these reasons, she reports using empirical data that the current sequential system results in the highest expected quality of the nominee. This is key because the office of the president is highly influential in policy outcomes. Howard of Harvard in 2005 writes that, for example, modern presidents have launched hundreds of military actions without congressional authorization. Presidents have unilaterally created a majority of administrative agencies. These policy mechanisms hardly exhaust the options available to the presidents who regularly invent new ones to suit their own strategic interests, which is why Tolbert of the University of Iowa in 2009 concludes that the American presidency has become the single most powerful political institution in the United States. For these reasons, Harrison and I strongly negate it.
No, a little bit better.
And I'll give you 30-second intervals.
Okay,
Alright, I'll give it a minute 53.
thanks.
Everybody ready? Reaffirm. Contention 1 is the powerful voice. Staggered primary elections give early states disproportionate influence. Diamond of Think Progress 2011 explains that party regulations effectively lock most states into position. The staggered schedule has 3 harms. First, narrowing choices. Andrea Cooper of the Christian Science Monitor 2008 explains that many candidates are forced to drop out before later primaries. Since state order is not based on representativeness of popular opinion, results do not reflect how well candidates represent national views. The Week 2016 continues that early staggered primaries lead candidates to discontinue campaigns earlier than necessary, which narrows the field for remaining states and decreases the deliberation necessary to formulate a representative party platform. Second, catering to early states. Brian Knight of Brown University 2010 finds that early voting states have 5 times the influence of later states in choosing candidates because early wins create momentum, giving the frontrunner an insurmountable lead. This leads prospective candidates to adopt positions favorable to early states. Taylor of North Carolina State University 2010 explains that each position closer to first in the primary leads to as much as 94 cents more per capita in procurement spending, meaning that the first state receives as much as $26 more per person in federal spending each year than the last states. Finally, decreasing turnout in later states. When races are decided well before some states even hold their primaries, turnout declines dramatically. Lana Atkinson of the University of New Mexico 2011 explains that overall turnout is cut by 15% of the electorate in states halfway through the cycle and 33% of the electorate in states last in the cycle. This is harmful because state legislature and judicial races that suffer from low turnout usually share a ballot with a presidential primary. Merkowitz of the Pacific Standard 2014 writes that a national primary day could finally encourage engagement in local and national races by standardizing the election date and keeping it in the public view. Contention 2, too long to function. The drawn-out primary process creates a media frenzy. Grutman of New America 2016 explains that continuous elections allow news organizations to cover primaries like horse races, continuously searching for and covering each candidate's slip-ups. The gotcha journalism discourages candidates from disclosing their views substantively, leaving voters unclear about the platform that they vote for. Patrick Withers of Fair Vote 2011 explains that the staggered elections depress turnout by fatiguing voters who cannot be perpetually engaged in the constant political he-said-she-said wrestling match. Those who do vote are more extreme, as Lewandowski of NYU 2011 writes that continuous media exposure increases political polarization by 44%. Raymond Smith of Columbia 2013 writes that a national primary day reduces the duration of a presidential campaign to as low as 2 months and forces pundits to focus on the candidate's platform by ending the stream of elections they can fixate on. The current drawn-out process has 2 harms. First, more divisive nominees. Increased media influence compounded with declining turnout leads the ACE Electoral Knowledge Network 2012 to explain that only the most strongly committed party members turn out in presidential primaries, which exaggerates the influence of radical voters. As a result of the staggered cycle, candidates are continuously rewarded for becoming more ideologically extreme with each win, which increases polarization. Garner of the University of Wyoming 2016 concludes that this would cause irreparable political violence and prevent future constructive political discourse. Second, overshadowing down-ballot races. Pundit Stuart Rothenberg 2016 explains that drawn-out presidential primary brawls divert voter attention away from other races. The repeated lineup of contests puts the focus on choosing a nominee instead of competitive local elections. Mike Shields of CNN writes that donors who could contribute to down-ballot races become fatigued by the nomination process and are thus reluctant to help down-ballot contestants. The harm is apparent as the presidency only represents one branch of the federal government. The legislative branch shapes U.S. policy, and Brookings 2005 explains that local politicians are the ones to carry out executive orders and federal mandates, making them necessary for a well-functioning representative democracy. Please affirm. When is this like staying for last thoughts here? Yeah, I might do a little research.
Is everybody ready?
Oh, one second.
So your second contention ultimately links through shortening the election season in a one-day primary, right?
We tell you that there's less horse race journalism to cover because there aren't as many polls or state delegate counts.
Yeah, I get that, but
Sure.
it all links through making the election season shorter.
Well, right, that's what we argue. We tell you that because you don't have, like, the fact that the current primary process is so drawn out provides the media much more opportunities to create negative coverage.
I got it.
Do you mind if I take the question?
Sure, go ahead.
So in your second contention, you say that presidents have lots of political power. So shouldn't they be representing majority views, not just the states that go first?
Well, I think that representation is not necessarily as important as good policy. For example, the reason that we are a republic and not a direct democracy is that if we were a direct democracy, we might be having things like walls on the southern border.
But that doesn't
We
answer
elect
my
our
question. How does the fact that Iowa and New Hampshire get to choose what most of the platforms are create better policy for the rest of the country?
Well, I would say that Iowa and New Hampshire are only 2 states. There are 48 others that the president still has to
Right,
concern
so those are the
himself
two
with.
states that go
Also,
first.
you're the one who tells me that the legislative branch is the one that passes policy on a local level, right? Presidents deal with more national issues in general. The president never passes bills that has to do with Iowa specifically.
So shouldn't they then be focusing on the areas with the largest delegate count like they would in a one-day primary?
Well, I would say it doesn't matter if the policy output doesn't change.
Like, because you argue that we should be representing national views, but in
Yeah.
a one-day primary, it actually does have to represent all 50 states at the same time.
Maybe in the primary itself, right? But what I am saying is that once the president actually gets into office, the president is never going to pass a bill specific to Iowa or New Hampshire. They have to pass more national
But we
bills.
tell you
Can I
that
ask you a
Iowa
question,
sees
please?
26
Wait,
voters
can
per
I just ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm just confused about the link to your second impact on the second contention. I don't really understand it. So how does polarization necessarily link to less focus on local elections?
Because when you have more polarization, it means that people are just going to be focusing on the primary coverage for presidents instead of other races which are equally important.
Do they always
like down
align?
ballot races.
Do they always align?
What do you mean?
Like, do local elections always align with the primary?
We argue that they do a lot of the time, and at that point,
How
even
often?
if they don't, we tell you that because there's so much media attention over the course of a drawn-out system, it's still diverting attention away from
Yeah,
down
so
ballot
just like
races,
how
even if they're on
often
different days.
do local elections overlap with the drawn out primary system?
I actually don't know that number. Do you mind if I take a question?
Sure.
So in your first contention, you tell me that there are a lot of barriers to entry when in a one-day primary. But
Yeah.
how do you solve that at the point where Citizens United already exists in both worlds?
No, we just make it worse.
How much worse? How many fewer candidates do we see turn up in the election?
There's no number of how much worse we make it, but the warrant stands the same, right? Because we say that when a one-day national primary is put into place, the
But if you can't
upfront,
give me the
wait, am I allowed
comparative
to answer?
difference- Yeah, of course.
The upfront cost, the cost that it takes for a candidate to run a national get out the vote campaign is much more expensive.
How much?
I don't
Like,
I
how do
don't
we
know,
weigh
enough
the
that it will
argument
shut out
comparatively?
candidates.
Okay, I'm going to start taking prep now.
Okay. "30 seconds used."
Okay.
Alright, 1 minute remaining, I'll try.
You want me to take this?
And I'll let you have road maps off time.
Is everyone ready? I'm just gonna go straight down to these.
Okay.
Start off with their first contention. Their first link is narrowing down choices. We have a couple responses to this. First, we would tell you that it's the con team that gives small candidates a chance it gives more candidates in the field in the first place. Because Daniel Kurzelbin of NPR explains the small size of the early states or gives candidates a chance to actually make an influence. Therefore, even if they prove that we're narrowing down the field more, it's solved back by the fact that we're creating more opportunity in the first place. But secondly, Chapman of US News explains that their system favors candidates who can afford to roll out huge efforts in every single state simultaneously. That's another way that they're shutting out more candidates in their world. But third, even if you buy that we are winnowing candidates, we would say that the need to prevent vote splitting outweighs this harm ultimately, right? Because if in the later states there's going to be problems with pluralities, that's more likely to benefit extremists who have ultimately might have like the largest concentration of individual support, but the rest of the country, right, doesn't typically support them, right? So typically somebody like Donald Trump will win a plurality, but not a majority in the vast majority of elections. So what that means is when vote splitting occurs, that means we see more worse candidates in their world. But let's go to their second link, which is catering to early states. First of all, what they don't recognize is that these early states include South Carolina and Nevada, two states that are very racially representative of minorities in this country and economically representative. Their card about early states having 5 times the influence is not specific to Iowa and New Hampshire. The current system solves back for the impact that they're claiming because it provides all segments of our population with the equal voice. But secondly, no candidate has ever just won Iowa and New Hampshire and called it a day, right? At the end of the day, you have to go through all primaries and win the nomination. In fact, Roman Sharameta of Purdue explains that we actually see an increase in effort post-winning these primaries because he finds that the sequential system, after winning the first race, candidates actually spend more on the election because now they have this momentum, right? Now they're trying to win more states. Now they're putting more effort into getting state lobbies. But then they tell you that turnout is going to decline. However, their own Atkinson card finds that their solvency is actually worse because it finds that when you put states on the same day, it reduces turnout because they receive less individual attention. But then they tell you that this encourages local participation. We would tell you that they don't prove any definitive link here because not all local participation coincides with presidential and federal participation. But B, I would tell you that the office of the executive is the most important thing at the end of the day. Remember what the Howell card tells you at the end of our case. The president is the single most powerful political institution in the United States. If we win presidency, we win the round. Let's go to their second contention. First of all, they concede in Crossfire that their solvency is through shortening the election season, which is why they actually have no solvency. Because Chris Moody of CNN explains that it doesn't change the schedule because candidates can start whenever they want. But secondly, their impact here is voter fatigue, essentially, that voters get disengaged from the process because they get tired. But with the long campaign cycle, voters fully process information that make informed votes, which outweighs voter fatigue. Partnoy 2012 explains that even though voter fatigue decreases, it would force people to speed up and prevent them from processing everything before making the proper decision, right? Information outweighs fatigue. But third, this horse race effect that they talk about is non-unique because polls would create the same horse race effect and would exist in either world. In fact, the horse race effect would rely entirely on polls in an AF world, and that would be much worse because Nate Silver of 538 explains that polls are an inaccurate measure, right? Insofar as their impact is non-unique, it's better that we rely on accurate information, not inaccurate information. But third, this horse race effect has the comparative benefit of keeping more voters more engaged because it's more exciting and more competitive. Even if it leads to some fatigue, I would say that that's outweighed by the fact that uncompetitive elections mean that people are disengaged from the system. But finally, they impact to radicalism. But I would tell you this is solved back because candidates have to shift back to moderacy in the general election, even if they have to win radical voters in the primary. And C, they don't show you how much local elections have an influence with national primaries.
I'm gonna take a few seconds.
Prep time starting now.
Alright.
Alright, I have you at 142.
Okay. It's going to start out with an overview, and then it's going to go straight down like this. Is everybody good to go? Polarization is the most important impact in the round for 2 reasons. The first of which is that polarization is the primary thing that leads to government mistrust. If people don't think that their government is accomplishing anything, then they're less likely to trust their government. That outweighs their first contention. The second reason that polarization is the most important impact in the round is because, as we tell you from Brookings, the executive is only one part of the larger picture of government. If polarization decreases the effectiveness of the legislative branch and local branches, federal mandates cannot be enforced. Go to their first contention, which argues that special interests are going to increase their influence. The first problem comes from the New York Times, which explains that the amount of money in politics would probably stay roughly the same because Citizens United v. FEC exists in both worlds. People are allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money. Nothing changes in their world. But second, James J. Feigenbaum of Wesleyan explains that the amount of money in primary elections doesn't affect the results of the primary election because people usually make their decision before they see things like ads. But it does affect the results of the general election. And this is where you can turn their contention against them. Because in a staggered primary election, if
if one party is continuously bleeding funds to decide their nominee, while the other party has already just picked a candidate, then they're going to be at a significant disadvantage come time for the general election, increasing the influence of money in politics. But my third response comes from Rebecca Kushminer, who explains that in the status quo, donors are the ones who choose whether or not there's going to be influence coming from these candidates. They're the ones that choose whether or not these candidates drop out, and consequently donors are already very important. But even further, turn the argument again, because if people don't have the initial capital to launch a 50-state operation, what they do instead is rely on grassroots organizations because those are significantly cheaper and they require significantly less work. That's critical because that'll decrease the amount of large money in politics on the whole. But fifth, he concedes in his rebuttal, in his third response to our second link in our first contention, that as a result of the staggered primary process, people spend more money as the race goes on. That means he's conceding in his rebuttal that there's more money in politics in a staggered election cycle. But even further, there's no unique impact coming off of government trust, because it doesn't necessarily impact the efficacy of the government on the whole. They're not proving that that's going to be a unique impact coming from the increase in money in politics. As is very apparent in Crossfire, they can't even tell you how much money in politics is going to increase. That's not going to be something that you weigh in the round. Go to their second contention, which essentially argues deliberation. First, they argue that there's this constant feedback process, but the Pew Research Service explains that only 1/4 of the people who turn out in the general election turn out in primary elections, meaning that the deliberative process and the signaling effect is only occurring amongst a small portion of candidates. But even further, the ACE Electoral Knowledge Network explains that only the most polarized turn out in polls. That means that candidates are continuously rewarded for becoming more extreme in the staggered primary process because they see that they'll lose states if they don't do so. Their second link into this argument is regional education. The first problem is, as he explains in Crossfire, the job of the federal government is to be an executive body. They're supposed to cover the entire United States. That's what we do in a one-day national primary. The legislative is the one that shapes local policy, but we would tell you that the legislative is overshadowed when we continuously focus on primary elections. But second, as he explains in his rebuttal, people shift back to the center during a general election. Thus, there's no net impact coming off of deliberation because people will just flip-flop to decide who they can cater to the most. That means that their second link doesn't have any impact either. But even further, turn the argument again, because the main reason that we have this increase in deliberation just comes from appealing to the early states. It doesn't come from appealing to any of the later states as well. That's really critical because if we're just focusing on Iowa and New Hampshire, like are the two examples that they give you, it doesn't necessarily lead to a long-term policy change at the federal level. Go to their third argument, which talks about voter coordination. First, 538 explains that a lot of the same typical candidates are going to be losing the primary election no matter what happens. For instance, just because Jeb Bush dropped out didn't mean that John Kasich was already the front runner, even though the establishment lane was open for him. That doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in who's going to be represented. It doesn't necessarily lead to an impact here. But second, Barbara Norander of the University of Illinois explains that as a result of having a one-day national primary, we would very likely change the way that votes are counted. That means that it's highly unlikely that a plurality candidate is elected because the parties simply wouldn't allow that to happen under a one-day national primary. They already understand the harms of vote splitting, which is why it's already incredibly likely that we do something like a runoff, for instance, or some type of preference system for choosing our candidates under a one-day national primary. That's really critical because it means that there's no fracturing.
Alright, so you're looking across.
Yeah. That's right.
Can you move to your own places?
Yeah.
Like the first cross. That worked better.
So when time starts, I'm gonna do this so that way you all know. Because usually you all end with like 10 seconds left on Crossfire.
Everyone ready? So you say the status quo is extremely polarized, right?
No, we say that the media is polarizing through primary
Right.
elections.
You say our current process is very polarized and the status quo is
It's
polarized,
pretty
right?
bad, yeah.
So what federal mandates are not being upheld, or like how many federal mandates are not being upheld because of this?
Well, what we tell you is that the down ballot is being overshadowed, which I think is a larger impact than just looking at specific policies that aren't being upheld.
Well,
Well, no, I
that's-
get what you're getting at, but just
Because
because I
like
can't
what
name a
you're weighing,
specific law.
you're weighing right at the top of your rebuttal is that polarization means that federal mandates don't get upheld. How frequently does this occur? How much is this happening?
We
in
tell you that
status quo?
polarization increases by 44%, that comes from Lewandowski.
Not
But
the
what's more
question.
critical, no, but like here, let me answer your question.
Yeah.
Any increase in polarization will decrease the amount of laws that are passed at a local level.
Okay.
Just because I can't point out a specific law
Not
that's
the
not
question.
going to be passed.
Not the question, right?
Okay.
I don't care about local laws, I care about federal laws. Tell me, how many federal laws are not upheld because of polarization?
Well,
How many people
the
just
Brookings
don't listen to
Institution-
Obama because they don't like
The
him?
Brookings Institution says that it happens, but if you look at the example of
So how am I
Obamacare, for
supposed to weigh
instance,
that?
so.
Wait,
if you look at-
Obamacare is like being provided to people
I
in the
mean,
status
individual
quo.
states choose to reject federal spending.
Yeah,
Like
and
Wisconsin,
millions
for
of
instance,
people still
decides
have
to expand
access to it,
Medicare,
right?
but what?
millions of people still have access to Obamacare.
Not
So
as
even
many
if,
as they should.
Wait, so even if some people still resist, right, the office, what is having a more powerful effect? The millions of people who now have access to healthcare through a federal mandate, right, or like some states resisting
You're
it?
trying to set up like a false dichotomy here. What we tell you is millions more would have access to it if there was less polarization. Can I ask you a
What
question?
I'm telling you is at the end of the day, if this round comes down to
Is this a question?
I'm sorry?
Is this a question?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So let's argue about your second contention, which discusses like continuous feedback, right?
Yeah.
Who are the types of people who turn out in primary elections?
According to you, it's extremist voters. I would say that it's like people who are more educated under our current system than they would be under your system.
That's fine. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So you tell me that in your rebuttal that like there's more spending proves that there's like more big money influence. Do you prove how do you prove though necessarily that like the more spending down the line comes from like big donors who typically pick their candidates before the primary even starts, as opposed to small donors who come in usually later?
Sure. So our argument is that any money in politics is pretty bad, but even further,
Wait,
what we
even
would
from
contend,
small donors?
what we would contend is if an establishment candidate like Jeb Bush, for instance, feels like he's losing, then the way that he's going to be supported eventually is people are going to say, we want to give you more money,
I mean, how
especially
did
the people
that
who are
work?
backing him from the beginning.
How did that work?
Well, it ended up with more money in politics. Even if he didn't get elected, it was actually more wasted funds.
What was the wasted funds by who? Rich people? I think that's a loss we
I
can
mean,
survive.
it's still money in the system. That's still like
But
going to
I
increase
think
crime.
money in the system is not necessarily an impact in and of itself, right? Like if small donors are the one who's giving the money, right? Like how is that an issue, right? Like do people see Bernie Sanders, who's gotten a ton of money,
We
like
argue-
small donations, as like a problem in the
We
system?
would argue that there's more small donors in our world because people can't rely on large donors to win these early states.
We'll take some.
Okay, we all have a minute left. Thirty seconds use.
Okay.
Alright, 22 seconds left.
Okay, I'm basically gonna start on their case, discussing some of the terms, and go back to my second or I'm gonna touch framework, I'm just gonna go back to my case after that. Okay. Is everybody ready? First voting issue is going to be extremism. That comes from the terms on their first contention. Specifically, we tell you that candidates increase efforts after the first primary because they know that they have to win more states. The reason that is key is because it increases voter turnout when you put more effort into the bigger states towards the end. That's corroborated by Atkinson, who says that a one-day primary actually decreases turnout because candidates go from state to state and that increases voter engagement. That's important for extremism because we tell you specifically, and so do they, that the people who typically turn out in primaries tend to be more extreme and the turnout is extremely low. That means that if we incentivize more people to vote, the median voter is going to be more moderate. Second, on voter information, it's the second place you can vote for us and it comes from their second contention. We tell you specifically that in a one-day primary, more voters would be relying on information from the polls, and that's incredibly bad because we read you evidence that says that polls are awful information. That means voters are making decisions that are poorly informed. But also on their second contention, you can de-link them entirely from polarization, their main offense, because we tell you that there is no change in the duration of the election season because candidates will just decide to start earlier so they can still do the best job to win the nomination. But now onto our case, specifically on this overview, we tell you the executive is the most important, and here's why this matters, because the presidents can literally come up with new tactics all the time to decide what they want to do. That means if we win the president, we win the round. On our first contention, this is about upfront costs, not money in all of politics. That means we're shutting out dark horse candidates who might sometimes be the best candidate in the race, which is why candidate quality is so important in our second contention. We tell you it is still important. He says that the U.S. federal government is the one that covers national issues in response to our second warrant, but we say that it's still important for candidates to understand how local politics works, and going state to state increases that. Secondly, on runoffs. Runoffs only break to the top 2 candidates, which is why it's such a bad solvency mechanism, because sometimes the best candidate is not one of the top 2 that received the votes that were split. That means we're increasing candidate quality, and that's the most important for the executive.
We're going to run some prep.
Okay. We all have room for you two.
Great, thank you.
What time starting now? Thirty seconds used. Alright, I have you at a minute 5.
Sounds good, thank you. Alright. I'm going to start on framework. I'm actually going to extend our pro case first, and then go and answer the con. Everyone ready? Sounds good. They don't respond to our framework that polarization has the biggest impact on choosing the correct candidates, which is not why that's how you're going to be deciding the round. Go to our first contention, we tell you that early states have an unequal influence. Basically, they say that after a win, people basically be spending more and more as the primary goes on. This is incredibly problematic for them because it concedes that there's more money in politics in a drawn-out system. You can de-link them for all of their offense. But then they review this Atkinson evidence saying that each candidate will get less attention than the primary. The problem is, because we reduce the opportunities for horse race coverage in our world, there's actually more time to cover these candidates in depth. There's actually more information about the candidates. But our second contention talks about the negative influence of media. First, recognize that even if the actual primary process is shortened, the media is still going to cover it for the same length, so we're not kicking out of those harms. But then you can look to Drutman, who explains that because there are fewer opportunities to cover things like delegate counts and horse races, it means that either A, you're going to be focusing on less media coverage, or B, the media coverage is going to have to be more substantial. That's why you can look to Live It Dusty, who says that if you don't vote pro, there's going to be an increase in polarization by 44%. That's who's deciding the president right now. And that's why the University of Wyoming explains that in the status quo will actually end discourse because there's so much polarization. Remember, they tell you that we're going to be focusing on polls in our world, but the problem is that because polls are often contradictory, it's harder to craft a consistent media narrative. Instead, they're just going to be focusing on substantive issues. That's where we will lead to more turnout because voters have more information and they're more likely to be creating a better decision. But go to the first contention on special interests. They completely extend through ink in their last summary. Remember the New York Times, who explains that Citizens United means they don't give you any unique benefit because there's still going to be money in politics in either world. And further, look at Kushmeider, who explains that if you vote con, you're still just letting rich donors decide who drops out. You're not creating more opportunities for deliberation. In fact, if you vote con, or if you vote pro rather, you're actually just going to be forcing people to rely more on grassroots movements, which is on net a benefit. But go to their second intention about building the president. They aren't responsive to the ACE, who explains that only the people right now are turning out are polarized, which means that the federal government should be covering the entire U.S. That's why they shouldn't just be going state to state. In fact, look to Norrander, who explains that we could be using something like a preference system. It doesn't have to necessarily result in a split ballot. Thank you.
Okay, is everybody ready? So I just missed the end of that summary. Why doesn't it necessarily result in a split ballot in a one-vote?
Okay, so what the Norrander evidence discusses is that parties are very aware of the possibility of having a plurality candidate. So under a system where we have a one-day national primary, there's so many different ways that we could get rid of the split ballot. It doesn't just have to be a runoff. It could be something like a preference system.
I think you're
it
kind
could be
of.
something
I
like
think you're kind of giving us a moving target here because, like, what are we supposed to respond to? Like, what is going to happen after a one-day national primary?
votes aren't going to be fractured.
I
And
can't
it's not
just
a moving
prove
target.
that, right? Like, I tell you that under a general runoff system, which is the most common in most elections, right? It's the top 2 candidates that break off, and under that system, the third and fourth, who might be the best, don't win.
It's
right?
only the most
So
common because early states in the status quo unfairly win with a
well,
few.
that's actually what proposals for a one-day national primary include: is a runoff that breaks to the top 2.
Let me answer this, right? So, in terms of your question, what we argue is that no matter what happens, it won't split the ballot because parties have all of these varieties of like
ways that they can get rid of that harm.
You tell me
It's
there are
not
all these
moving
ways,
target.
but
Can we
without
agree
knowing what
with-
these ways
can
are,
can we agree that the most common way that that is done is through runoff?
I mean, if you guys read evidence in the next speech that says that, I
You
would
were the
say
one that
that's
literally
like-
said in your rebuttal it would most likely be a
No, I
runoff.
didn't say that. I said it would most likely change the process of counting votes.
Wait.
I used the runoff as my first example,
What
and
are
in my
other-
second
what
example, I
other
said
examples? What is a
system.
preference system?
So literally like the way you rank friends rounds, for instance, like 1 through 6.
Okay, how many elections use that?
I mean, there are elections that do.
Right,
Which
are you
one?
okay
Like,
changing
this
the
is
status
exactly
quo?
the definition of a moving like
Wouldn't
you're
a
saying
preference
there
system
are
still
methods of
result in
doing this,
votes?
but I don't know
Let me
what they
answer your
are.
question.
There are elections that use this, but I don't know
Let me
what they
answer your
are.
question.
You are literally giving us a moving target.
Let
This
me
is
answer
so
your
unfair. Yeah.
Right now, the party doesn't have an incentive to create that because there's less likelihood of a split vote because the early states narrow. At the point where they have an incentive because there are more candidates, we tell you they're more likely to switch to a better
Wait.
system that doesn't split vote.
We've been spending a
Hold
lot
on.
of time on this. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So let's talk about building the candidate, right? So we both agree that the most polarized individuals are the ones to turn out. Like that's something you said in your
So
summary.
when there's low turnout, extremism is generally high.
Do you guys have a question?
Yeah. So you tell me in summary that polarization has the biggest impact on choosing the candidate. But like when was that ever the weighing analysis as you presented it earlier?
That's not. I think you're mischaracterizing. what
That's
being said.
literally what Sullivan
That's-
said at the top of his summary.
Well, I'm Kale, right?
Yeah,
So-
I know. That's why I corrected myself.
Alright, well, thank you. So the issue is, the way that we're running the framework, like there were 2 justifications that I gave, neither of which were substantively addressed in the summary. The first justification that I gave is, if there's a polarized government, you're not going to accomplish anything, so trusting government
Okay.
goes down
We
significantly.
tell you, actually,
second
Anton
way-
does address that in summary. He
Yeah.
tells you that the executive outweighs because the president is literally uber
So
powerful.
then the
The
They
second
can come
way
up
there's
with
an
new
equal
strategies.
separation of powers between all the branches,
Well,
which is
yeah,
why we
Actually,
should
our
separate
card
them.
literally takes that into account, right?
Is there a question?
So what we would argue, in order to answer your question, is that they're still necessary in order to make the executive function well.
How much more time do we have left?
You all have 22 seconds left. Starting now. 15 seconds remaining. And that is time.
Okay. Opponents ready? Partner. Judges. Start off on the framework. They tell you polarization is the most important thing, but they never address the Howell card, which Aton extends to the summary, which tells you the president can literally come up with new policy mechanisms to come up with, to follow whatever strategic strategies they want to implement in terms of policy, through executive orders, through mandates, etc. They give you no example of when polarization has ever prevented this from happening, right? So at the end of the day, what that means is that the president is the most powerful political office. If we win candidate equality, even if they win some polarization, we win the round. But even if you don't buy that, let's go on to their offense and show why they don't win it. The biggest and clear reason why they lose this horse race effect is they never respond to our response that they're not changing the election season because candidates can start whenever they want. They drop that in every single speech and they concede in first crossfire that that is their solvency mechanism. But even if you don't buy that, we tell you that there will be more reliance on polls in their world and those are wildly inaccurate. Their only response is that polls are contradictory, so the media can't create a unified narrative. But the media doesn't attempt to create a unified narrative anyways because the media is fragmented and has different views. So what that means is that's non-unique and that doesn't explain the change that they're talking about. So in their world, we'd still have fragmentation and we'd have less accurate information for voters to rely on. That means worse quality candidates. That links into our framework, which is the most important thing. But let's go to money in politics. They non-unique it because they say Citizens United doesn't means that it doesn't matter. Fine, we can see that impact is really really in the round. Let's go to what really matters, which is vote splitting. They give us a moving target this entire time, saying there's going to be some way of solving it, but don't give us the way that that's going to be. I tell you that a runoff wouldn't solve, and that's the way that that elections generally try to do these things, and those only break to the top two candidates, right? So that means you're going to face the issue of vote splitting, which links into the candidate quality framework that they're talking about. And they never respond to our analysis, right? We tell you that the president is the most important office at the executive, at the federal level, which affects every single person in the United States. Even if they win some impacts at the local level, even if they win some polarization, we outweigh.
Do you all want to run the rest of your prep talk?
Please.
Alright, you all have a minute 5.
Thanks.
Seconds used. Fifteen seconds remaining.
So, it's going to start out at the framework level. I think it's on the negative at this point. Down the negative and back to the affirmative. Okay. Everybody good to go?
Yep.
Starting out on the issue of framework, what we told you from the Brookings Institution is even though the executive branch can craft whatever strategy they want, local officials can block it. The example that we gave you in Second Crossfire was Obamacare, because individual states refused the federal spending. At that point, we're giving you a clear example, we're giving you a clear warrant, and we're giving you the evidence from the Brookings Institution that it actually happens. That's why polarization is going to outweigh their entire case. But even further, we're going to win under their framework as well. Under their first contention about special interests, we turned the argument because we told you that if people don't have initial capital, they're going to rely more on grassroots. The reason is because they don't have the ability to mount this initial capital fund, so as a result, they're going to have to rely on the smaller donors instead. That's really critical because it means that we're turning money in politics, even if they try in their last speech to kick out of it. Go to their second contention, which discusses building a better candidate. Remember, what we both concede is that in the status quo, only the most polarized people are turning out. That's coming from the ACE Electoral Knowledge Network, and they never substantively address that at all. That's really critical because the only people who are giving the candidates feedback are the most polarized members of each party. Under their framework of building a better president, that's going to be extremely harmful because the president is only going to be one who focuses on the base of his party instead of the entire country. That means that we're going to be winning under their framework, under their own second contention. Then he tries to tell you that we're a moving target with the runoff system. The problem is, in my rebuttal, I never said that that would be the only possibility. I said that it's one of many possibilities, but the point is the parties are going to try to solve the issue of plurality voting. So if they argue that the top two system does not solve the issue of plurality voting, the parties are probably going to choose some different method. With that, go back to our second contention. This is where you're going to be signing your ballot. Because our link in isn't that the campaigning process is shorter, it's that the election process is shorter. So the media can't cover elections like horse races. At that point, we're taking out of their D link, which argues that the election process is going to be longer. But even if you buy that people are going to start campaigning earlier, this is really critical because it means that any candidate can gain momentum whenever they want, addressing the harms of their first contention. We increased polarization by 44% according to Lewandowski. That's really critical because increasing polarization means the executive can accomplish nothing. It means that we can't do anything in terms of the presidency, and it means that we have a significantly worse candidate. That's why you're going to be voting for us. We increase representation on the whole.